I'm a barista in Portland and watched a customer insist his coffee was supposed to be extra hot, despite the thermometer reading showing it was already at the maximum safe temperature. He demanded we remake it 3 times, each time claiming it wasn't hot enough. The manager finally just pretended to use a special extra hot setting on the machine, which was literally the same button as before. The customer nodded with satisfaction after the 4th identical cup. I wanted to explain that physics has limits, but sometimes people need to feel like they've won something, even when nothing has actually changed.
Working as a substitute teacher in suburban Ohio, I once had a parent argue that her son's incorrect math answer should be marked right because he understood the concept. The problem was simple. 2 + 3 = 5, but her son had written 6. She insisted that since he was close and showed good effort, the traditional rules of arithmetic shouldn't apply. I tried explaining that mathematics isn't subjective, but she kept saying I was crushing his creativity. Eventually, I just asked if she'd prefer that bridges were built by engineers who got close enough to the right calculations.
I'm an American who moved to Japan for work, and the first time I was wrong about something in a meeting, I started making excuses. My Japanese colleagues just listened quietly until I finished. Then one simply said, I see. Thank you for explaining. No defensiveness, no elaborate justifications. Later, my supervisor told me that being wrong isn't shameful there, it's just information. I realized I'd been carrying this weight of needing to be right all the time, like admitting a mistake would somehow make me less valuable as a person.
At a dinner party in Austin, I watched a guy argue for 20 minutes that Los Angeles was further north than San Francisco. When someone finally pulled up a map on their phone, he doubled down and claimed the map was outdated. Then he said GPS was unreliable. Then he insisted that north was subjective depending on your perspective. The host finally changed the subject, but I couldn't stop thinking about how exhausting it must be to live in a reality where basic geography is negotiable.
I'm a software developer, and once had a client insist that a feature I'd built exactly to specification was completely wrong. I showed him the requirements document he'd signed, the emails where he'd approved the design, the screenshots from our review meeting. He waved it all away and said those were just starting points for what he really wanted. When I explained that we'd need additional budget to rebuild it, he acted like I was extorting him. I ended up rebuilding it for free just to avoid a bad review, which I guess proves his strategy worked. My first week working at a coffee shop in Seattle, a regular customer insisted I'd been making his drink wrong for months. I'd never worked there before, but he was so certain that he started questioning whether I was even the same person who'd served him yesterday. He described the other barista in detail, my exact height, hair color, and even mentioned my distinctive tattoo. When I pointed out the tattoo on my own arm, he just said, and continued insisting the drink was wrong. I remade it the exact same way, and he said, much better. I'm a nurse in Florida and once had a patient argue that his blood pressure reading was wrong because the machine didn't like him. He insisted we take it manually, which gave the same result. Then he claimed the cuff was defective. We tried 3 different cuffs, all showing his blood pressure was dangerously high. He finally said the entire medical establishment was conspiring against him and left against medical advice. 3 days later, he was back in the ER when a stroke. Sometimes being wrong isn't just about ego, it's about survival.
During my college years in California, I took a philosophy class where a student argued that 2 + 2 could equal 5 if we just redefined our terms. The professor, patient as a saint, asked him to demonstrate this new mathematics. The student wrote 2 + 2 = 5 on the board and claimed that was proof enough. When the professor gently explained that symbols need consistent meaning to function, the student accused him of being trapped in colonial thinking. I learned that day that some people would rather burn down the entire concept of truth than admit they made a simple error.
I'm a mechanic in Detroit and had a customer insist his car was making a noise that I couldn't hear, even with specialized diagnostic equipment. He stood there while I ran every test possible, all showing normal operation. He finally said I must be deaf or incompetent and demanded to speak to my manager. My manager took him for a test drive, heard nothing unusual, but suggested maybe it was a different noise than what the customer was describing. The guy got furious and said we were gaslighting him. He drove off in a huff, tires squealing, and I wondered if that was the sound he'd been hearing all along.
Working as a tour guide in Boston, I once had a tourist argue that Paul Revere was the first president of the United States. When I explained the actual timeline of American history, she said her teacher had told her differently, and therefore I was wrong. She even pulled out her phone to show me a TikTok that proved her point. The video was clearly satirical, but she was dead serious. I realized then that for some people, being corrected feels like a personal attack rather than an opportunity to learn something new.
I'm a librarian in Chicago and watched a patron insist that a book he'd never returned wasn't overdue because he'd renewed it in his mind. When I explained that mental renewals don't update our computer system, he accused me of being part of the digital surveillance state. He claimed that in a truly free society, people should be able to keep library books as long as they needed them spiritually. I wanted to ask if that applied to the 30 other people waiting to read it, but I just smiled and calculated his fine.
My neighbor in Phoenix insists his lawn is greener than mine, even though we both have the same brown patches from the summer heat. Every time I mention that we're both struggling with the same water restrictions, he launches into a 20-minute explanation about his special technique that involves watering at exactly 3 a.m. while playing classical music for the grass. I've seen his technique. It's a regular sprinkler system that runs for the same amount of time as mine. But somehow, in his mind, his brown patches are superior to my brown patches.
I'm a fitness instructor in Miami and had a client argue that calories don't count if you eat standing up. When I explained basic metabolism, she said that was old science and that she'd read online about a woman who lost weight eating nothing but donuts, as long as she was vertical while consuming them. I tried to explain that being upright burns minimal extra calories, but she insisted I was just trying to sell more training sessions. She eventually switched to a trainer who believed in her truth, which I guess is one way to find a professional who tells you what you want to hear.
At a family reunion in Georgia, my uncle spent an hour explaining why the moon landing was fake, complete with YouTube videos he downloaded to prove his point. When my cousin, who actually works for NASA, tried to explain the science, my uncle just talked louder and faster. He kept saying, "Do your research," while showing videos with dramatic music and zero actual evidence. Eventually, my cousin just started agreeing with him, saying things like, "You're absolutely right, Uncle Bob. Gravity is just a theory." Sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing the game.
I'm a bartender in New Orleans and watched a guy argue that his credit card was declined because the machine was prejudiced against people from his neighborhood. When I explained it was probably just insufficient funds, he accused me of class discrimination. He then tried to pay with a different card from the same bank, which also got declined. Rather than consider that maybe he was over his limit, he launched into a conspiracy theory about how banks systematically target certain zip codes. I comped his drink just to end the conversation.
Working at a tech startup in San Francisco, I once had a colleague insist that our product was working perfectly despite customer complaints flooding our support channels. When I showed him the error logs and user feedback, he claimed those were just edge cases and that real users loved our product.
He even cherry-picked one positive review out of hundreds of negative ones as proof that we were succeeding. Eventually, our CEO had to step in and acknowledge the obvious problems, but my colleague still insisted he'd been right all along and that the fixes were just minor optimizations.
I'm a teacher in Texas and had a parent argue that her son's failing grade in chemistry was actually an A because effort should count for more than correctness. She brought in a portfolio of his homework showing he'd tried really hard, even though most of his answers were wrong. When I explained that chemistry requires accurate understanding of molecular structures and reactions, she said that was ableist thinking and that we should value different ways of knowing. I wanted to ask if she'd like her son's surgeon to have that same flexible approach to anatomy, but I bit my tongue.
My roommate in college insisted she was allergic to water, which made showering and drinking interesting logistical challenges. When I pointed out that the human body is mostly water, she said that was different because it was her water. She drinks soda and juice just fine, but claimed tap water gave her hives. I once watched her accidentally drink a glass of water without realizing it, and when I pointed it out afterward, she suddenly started scratching her arms and saying she felt strange. The power of suggestion is truly remarkable. I'm a dog trainer in Denver and had a client insist her dog was gifted and could understand complex English sentences. When I try to explain that dogs primarily respond to tone in simple commands, she said I was underestimating her baby's intelligence. She'd have long conversations with her golden retriever about philosophy and claimed he nodded at appropriate times. During our training sessions, she'd interpret every random bark as a profound insight. I finally suggested we focus on basic obedience, and she accused me of trying to dim her dog's light.
At a wedding in Nashville, I watched a groomsman give a toast where he claimed to have introduced the couple, even though everyone there knew they'd met in college before he'd ever met either of them. When people started correcting him, he doubled down and said there must be some confusion about the timeline. He even fabricated details about the supposed meeting, describing a restaurant that had closed years before the couple met. Rather than create a scene, everyone just let him have his moment, and I realized that some people would rather rewrite history than admit a simple mistake.
I am a gardener in Portland and had a customer insist that tomatoes were vegetables, not fruits. When I explained the botanical definition, she said that was just scientist opinion and that her grandmother had always called them vegetables, so that's what they were. She even brought up the Supreme Court case that classified them as vegetables for tax purposes, as if legal definitions override biological reality. I tried to explain that both could be true, legally vegetables, botanically fruits, but she insisted I was being difficult. Sometimes people want simple categories, even when nature refuses to cooperate.
Working at a bookstore in Seattle, I once had a customer argue that we'd shelved a book in the wrong section because she'd read the author's mind and knew it belonged in mystery, not romance. When I showed her the publisher's classification and the author's own description, she said those were just marketing lies. She claimed to have a psychic connection with the writer that transcended mundane things like genre conventions. I ended up walking away and letting her move the book herself, figuring it was easier than explaining that telepathy probably isn't the best cataloging system.
I am a chef in Las Vegas and watched a customer send back a perfectly cooked steak 3 times, each time claiming it wasn't medium rare despite hitting the exact temperature. On the 3rd attempt, I watched him cut into it before it even reached the table, then complain it was overcooked. When I explained that cutting into it immediately lets all the juices escape, making it seem drier, he said that was chef propaganda. He finally declared that no one in Vegas knew how to cook a proper steak, even though our restaurant had a Michelin star. Some battles you just can't win.
My dentist in Minneapolis told me about a patient who insisted she didn't need to floss because she'd read online that it was a conspiracy by dental floss manufacturers. When he showed her the actual research and her own x-rays showing gum disease, she claimed the images were digitally altered. She even brought printouts from conspiracy websites claiming that all dentists were part of a global plot to sell unnecessary products. He finally just gave her the standard lecture and let her make her own choices, because you can't reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into.
I'm a rideshare driver in Los Angeles and had a passenger insist the traffic laws didn't apply to him because he was manifesting clear roads. When I explained that manifestation doesn't override physics or traffic signals, he said I was being negative and blocking his abundance. He spent the entire ride telling me about how he'd never gotten a ticket because he simply refused to acknowledge the possibility of police officers existing in his reality. I wanted to ask if that same logic applied to gravity, but I just focused on getting him to his destination without any negative accidents.
At a community meeting in Philadelphia, a neighbor argued that the proposed bike lanes would actually increase traffic because cars need more space to feel comfortable. When urban planners presented studies showing the opposite, he claimed those were biased because they were done by bike people. He even brought his own research, consisting of photos he'd taken of empty bike lanes during a thunderstorm, as if that proved anything about normal usage. The planners finally just nodded and moved on, and I realized that some people will always prefer their feelings over facts.
I'm a wedding photographer in Charleston and had a bride insist that sunset was at 3 p.m. for her outdoor ceremony. When I showed her multiple weather apps and astronomical charts showing sunset was actually at 7:30 p.m., she said those were just estimates and that she could feel when the light would be perfect. She'd apparently read somewhere that intuition was more reliable than science, and she was trusting her guts over my professional experience and basic astronomy. I ended up scheduling the ceremony for the actual sunset time and just told her it was 3 p.m. in photographer time.
Working at a tech support call center, I once had a customer insist her computer was broken because it wouldn't respond to voice commands. When I explained that her desktop computer didn't have voice recognition software, she said that was false advertising because the computer had a microphone jack. She demanded a refund for her 5-year-old computer, claiming it should have been future-proofed for technology that didn't exist when she bought it. I transferred her to my supervisor, who spent an hour explaining that you can't yell at a Dell desktop and expect it to open Microsoft Word.
I'm a personal trainer in San Diego and had a client argue that muscle weighs more than fat, so her weight gain was actually proof she was getting fitter. When I explained that a pound is a pound regardless of what it's made of, she said that was conventional thinking and that her body worked differently. She even claimed that her muscles were dense energy that the scale couldn't properly measure. I tried explaining basic physics, but she insisted I was just trying to sell more sessions. She eventually found a trainer who understood her body's unique relationship with gravity.
My cousin in Kansas insists he has a photographic memory despite constantly forgetting birthdays, appointments, and where he put his keys. When I pointed out these contradictions, he said he only had photographic memory for important things, not mundane details. He even claimed he could remember entire conversations word for word from years ago. Though when we tested this with a recent discussion, he couldn't recall what we'd talked about 10 minutes earlier. But asking him to consider that maybe his memory wasn't as perfect as he believed was apparently an attack on his entire identity.
I'm a chef in Las Vegas and watched a customer send back a perfectly cooked steak 3 times, each time claiming it wasn't medium rare despite hitting the exact temperature. On the 3rd attempt, I watched him cut into it before it even reached the table, then complain it was
Working at a farmer's market in Vermont,
I once had a customer argue that tomatoes grown in greenhouses weren't real tomatoes because they didn't have to struggle against the elements. When I explained that they were genetically identical to field tomatoes, she said that was reductionist science and that suffering made vegetables more nutritious. She even claimed she could taste the lack of character in greenhouse produce. I wanted to ask if she'd prefer her vegetables to have traumatic childhoods, but I just smiled and sold her the field tomatoes at twice the price.
I'm a music teacher in Austin and had a parent insist her child was a musical prodigy who didn't need to practice scales because he played from the soul. When I tried to explain that even prodigies need technical foundation, she said I was trying to suppress his natural gift. She even brought recordings of him banging randomly on a piano, claiming it was avant-garde composition that traditional teachers couldn't appreciate. I suggested she find an instructor who specialized in soul-based pedagogy, which she took as validation of her approach.
At a book club in Denver, a member argued that the author definitely meant for the protagonist to be secretly transgender, despite no textual evidence supporting this interpretation. When others pointed out that the book was published in 1952 and the character showed no signs of gender dysphoria, she accused us of having limited imagination. She even claimed the author had told her this personally in a dream. Rather than debate dream communications, we just let her have her interpretation and moved on to discuss actual plot points from the book we'd all read.
I'm a chef in Las Vegas and watched a customer send back a perfectly cooked steak 3 times, each time claiming it wasn't medium rare, despite hitting the exact temperature. On the 3rd attempt, I watched him cut into it before it even reached the table, then complain it was like... Working at a camping supplies store in Montana, I once had a customer argue that bears were actually vegetarians who only ate fish because modern humans had disrupted their natural diet. When I explained that bears are omnivores and have always eaten both plants and animals, he said that was Park Service propaganda designed to scare people. He even claimed he'd watched a documentary about peaceful berry-eating bears that proved his point. I didn't have the heart to tell him that the documentary was probably about pandas, not grizzlies.
I'm a tutor in Boston and had a student insist that Shakespeare wrote in Old English that was impossible for modern readers to understand. When I showed him actual Old English, which looks like German and English had a baby, then showed him that Shakespeare wrote in early modern English, he said that was just academic hair-splitting. He even claimed his English teacher had confirmed that Shakespeare and Beowulf were written in the same language. Rather than argue, I just focused on helping him understand the actual text, which he managed just fine once he stopped insisting it was incomprehensible.
My brother-in-law in Wisconsin insists he can taste the difference between bottled water brands, even in blind tests where he's consistently wrong. When we set up a proper blind taste test and he failed to identify his favorite brand, he said the test was flawed because we've repeated the test multiple times with the same results, but he maintains that his palate is just too sophisticated for simple blind testing.
I'm a travel agent in Orlando and had a client insist that Europe was a country, not a continent. When I showed her maps and geography textbooks, she said those were outdated because the EU makes it basically one country now. She even claimed her high school geography teacher had taught her this modern understanding of European politics. I tried explaining the difference between political unions and geographical continents, but she insisted I was being pedantic. She finally agreed to book her trip to the country of Europe as long as she got to visit both France and Spain while she was there.
Working at a pet shop in Portland, I once had a customer argue that fish don't need water because they have gills for breathing air. When I explained that gills extract oxygen from water, not air, she said that was aquarium industry propaganda designed to sell expensive equipment. She even claimed her goldfish preferred breathing air and had been living out of water for weeks. I suggested she might be thinking of a different kind of pet, but she insisted I was trying to limit her fish's lifestyle choices.
I'm a yoga instructor in Sedona and had a student insist that she didn't need to follow my alignment cues because her body had different energy meridians than most people's. When I tried to explain basic anatomy and how poses work with muscle groups and bone structure, she said I was thinking too linearly and that her chakras required unique positioning. She even claimed she'd studied with a guru in India who taught customized yoga that adapted to each person's spiritual blueprint. I suggested she might be happier with private sessions where she could explore her unique meridians without disrupting the class.
My brother-in-law in Wisconsin insists he can taste the difference between bottled water brands, even in blind tests where he's consistently wrong. When we set up a proper blind taste test and he failed to identify his favorite brand, he said the test was flawed because stress affects taste buds. He even claimed that bottled water companies add signature minerals that create distinct flavor profiles. We've repeated the test multiple times with the same results, but he maintains that his palate is just too sophisticated for simple blind testing. At a coffee tasting in Seattle, a participant insisted she could taste notes of chocolate and despair in a single-origin Ethiopian bean. When the roaster explained that coffee doesn't actually contain chocolate, and certainly not despair, she accused him of having an unsophisticated palate. She even claimed to be a super taster who could detect emotions that had been absorbed by the coffee plants during growing. Rather than debate the emotional lives of coffee beans, the roaster just nodded and suggested she might prefer a different roast that better matched her tasting abilities.
I'm a locksmith in Philadelphia and had a customer insist that his key should still work even though he'd broken it off in the lock. When I explained that broken keys can't engage the pins properly, he said that was defeatist thinking and that I should be able to communicate with the lock's energy to make it recognize the key's intention. He even suggested I meditate with the broken key to understand its true purpose. I ended up just replacing the lock, which apparently was what the key's energy wanted all along.
Working at a wine shop in Napa Valley, I once had a customer insist that white wine was just red wine with food coloring added. When I explained that they were made from different grapes and production methods, she said that was wine snob mythology, designed to justify higher prices. She even claimed she'd visited a winery where they'd shown her the coloring station, where they transformed red wine into white. I suggested she might be thinking of a different beverage entirely, but she insisted I was part of the conspiracy to keep wine secrets from regular people.
I'm a math tutor in Silicon Valley and had a parent insist that her child's incorrect answers were actually correct in base infinity, where all numbers are essentially the same. When I tried to explain that base infinity isn't a real mathematical concept, she said that was traditional thinking and that her child was operating on a higher mathematical plane. She even claimed that Einstein had worked in base infinity, but that mainstream mathematicians suppressed this knowledge. I suggested she might prefer a tutor who's specialized in alternative mathematics, which she took as validation of her child's genius.